Delicious in Dungeon opens with the premise of Laos's party, short on supplies and shorter on time, needing to make their way through the dungeon to save Fallon. If you're watching this channel in the year of our Lord 2025, you know the drill. And in about 5 minutes into the return to this dungeon, we realize that these characters, although they mean well, might be a bit out of their depth. Laos doesn't exactly seem like he's Gordon Ramsay in the kitchen, Marcellus will say less than thrilled about surviving off of monsters, and Chilchuck, dude, just Venmo Chilchuck $200 for child support payments and he's out of here. The team seems like they're headed nowhere fast, but when all hope seems lost, enter Senshi. Senshi is introduced as a lovable, fatherly dwarf man, hailing from, I don't know, wherever dwarves come from in this universe. We'll get to that. And right away, Senshi shows Laos the proper ways to cook mushrooms and scorpions, saves Marcel, and explains the real-world applications of slimes, and makes a banger meal out of a bunch of 2 XP level 1 monsters. Let's be so real, this adventure would have been over before it even began, but suddenly, through Senshi, there's a glimmer of hope, and the story can begin in earnest. Introducing a mentor character to guide a would-be hero isn't exactly rewriting the script on fantasy. In a very Star Warsian sense, meeting the supernatural advisor is Hero's Journey 101, and in a world where our main character is a little different from most main characters, Reed obsessed with meeting and eating monsters, Senshi is the closest thing to an expert in the field as there is. In traditional fantasy stories, we can look to Obi-Wan, Gandalf, Dumbledore. They all strike the same rough archetype of wizened old men here to guide a relatively naive young protagonist on the correct path to realizing their heroic destiny. In anime, we still get wizened old men guiding the MC on their path, except in anime, a wizened old man is usually like 28 years old with an entire lifetime of trauma that we learn about in a backstory somewhere. It's also kind of typical for anime mentors to be some of the coolest, flashiest characters in the entire series. Yes, Piccolo, we see the fit. And to this day, these are some of the most popular characters in their respective franchises. Senshi is different because, like, well, everything else in Dungeon Meshi, he doesn't really fit in with either of those templates. He's a really good cook, sure, and he's a really knowledgeable dungeoneer, but he's not a nearly omnipotently powerful Gandalf, or Obi-Wan, or even a Kakashi or a Gojo. He's the furthest thing from being one of the strongest characters in the entire verse, and he certainly doesn't have the shoujo girlies swooning, because it's the josei girlies. It's Dungeon Meshi's more grounded stakes that make him so valuable specifically to the world Ryoko Kui is trying to create. Much like Laos would be a middling at best protagonist outside of this world, so too would Senshi be as a traditional mentor. In this very specific situation, cast, and world, Senshi and the rest of the party are a perfect pairing. I've said before that all of the characters of Dungeon Meshi offer their own versions of exposition that flesh out this world, and Senshi is the character through who we learn the ecosystem of the dungeon. If Laos is there to read a monster's stat block and identify the lore and weaknesses, Senshi is there as a first-hand witness to how that monster exists as part of its greater environment, how it acts in its natural surroundings. Laos is the play-by-play, the stats guy, and Senshi is the color commentary. We know that the dungeon isn't specifically beholden to any single biome or even physical form really, so Senshi fills us in on everything up to the furthest he typically ventures. Up until crossing that lake, Senshi knows every nook and cranny of the dungeon, at least when it's not magically altering itself at the whims of somebody, and it's to the point where he's almost voluntarily become a bit of a dungeon custodian. Senshi tends to the dungeon in a way that no one else does. We've seen other tall men and humanoid races in the dungeon, but they're there for their own reasons, whether it be treasure, trade, or territory. But we don't really see other characters care for the dungeon as an actual place like Senshi does, tending to golems, feeding kelpies, emptying chamber pots. At least, as far as we know as viewers, nobody else is doing this. It's certainly not other adventurers, and I'd be surprised if orc tribes were really about that life. Senshi is kind of the odd man out in the way that he genuinely cares about the world around him as more than just a physical space. Kind of a climate activist king, to be honest. Which is also kind of ironic that throughout the latter half of Season 1, where the drama and more surreal elements are really ramping up, I was already kind of saying that this dungeon and this story almost serves as a fictive analog for a stomach, with desires and adventures and souls being a sort of metaphorical, maybe literal nourishment. And so for Senshi to tend not only to the stomachs of everyone in the dungeon, but also kind of facilitate the greater stomach that is the dungeon as a whole is just kind of poetry. It's this desire to help the dungeon environment and ecosystem around him, combined with the practical knowledge of actually doing so, that gives Senshi a real seasoned adventurer feel, which starkly opposes basically the entire party as we meet them. The just happy to be here Laios, the bookish Marcel, and the all about his big adult man business Chilchuck. The rest of the party are about hypotheticals, what they've read or heard, what they were taught to do in school, what worked the last time they adventured, or through watching countless hours of cryptid sighting YouTube. But Senshi offers his own lived experience from years of maintaining the dungeon, and years before that, surviving in the dungeon. But it's also through this lived experience that we come to the major flaws of Senshi as a character. More than anyone in Dungeon Meshi's main cast, Senshi is inflexible. And I'm not talking like that. Where Marcel is the one that learns to put her disgust of eating monsters aside, Laios has to tame his hyperfixations for just 1 second and focus on real people and relationships, and Chilchuck needs to stop pretending to be too cool to care. It's Senshi who maybe has the hardest time in changing his outlook. You see, Senshi is a real pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of guy. He's a boomer. He's your dad. He'd be the one recommending that in order to apply for a job, you just walk into the building you want to work at and ask to speak to the guy who runs the place and say, "So when do I start?" while sliding over a resume. He's unaware, almost stubbornly so, that the world doesn't always work like how he remembers, that the rules he used to play by aren't the rules that a new crop of adventurers need to be using, especially at what seems like the most dire situation that this dungeon and this island has ever seen. He's quick to lecture Marcel about using magic and the proper ways that she's studied, and he routinely calls out magic as a shortcut, likening it to an over-reliance on convenience. But is he wrong? That's kind of what makes Dungeon Meshi's interpersonal relationships so compelling, that even when we have two characters firmly opposing each other's worldviews, we can understand where they're both coming from. Just because a character might have a different outlook doesn't mean that it's wrong. In fact, it's this diversity, this outside-the-box thinking, and this willingness to accept the party as they are on their own terms and learn from them and what they offer. That's what makes the main cast of Delicious in Dungeon work. It's arguably the biggest reason they've made it this far. Maybe the only reason they've made it this far. So what gives Senshi a disarming amount of humanity as a character is the fact that he readily admits to being wrong. And we spend enough time with these characters that even through the course of Season 1, we see Senshi begin to change. In the Mandrake episode, Senshi admits that even though he didn't necessarily agree with Marcel's method, and I mean honestly, who would, the Mandrake that was harvested by the way it was supposed to, by the books, did taste better in the end. That even though it wasn't how Senshi normally did it, it was the correct way. After walking across the lake, we get this real beautiful moment where Senshi becomes more accepting of the idea of magic, and does let Marcel give him the Reddit mod shower. And hell, by the end of the series, Senshi is all but looking on like a proud father as Laios learns the basics of magic for himself, no longer bemoaning that magic is a cheap trick, but having instead learned that maybe, just maybe, there's space for both. Magic doesn't have to be doing things the easy way, especially now that he's seen firsthand how much work goes into practicing it, into studying it. All of Laios and Marcel's effort doesn't go unnoticed. And even though magic, like hypothetically reviving people with forbidden magic, still conflicts with his worldview, he's still willing to be there for the ride. Hell, he's the one that suggests Laios draws the magic circle for Dryad Seed Tea himself, something that he probably never would have done in episode 1. That's character development, baby. Another way, perhaps the most obvious, is Senshi enriches the story of Dungeon Meshi's through, well, cooking. It might seem obvious, but a story about cooking is best guided by an experienced chef, and this is where Senshi's character shines. What seems like nasty monster parts are masterfully crafted into dishes in fresh and unexpected ways. We don't just see the end result in Dungeon Meshi. No. In every episode, we get a full-on mini cooking show where Senshi could hypothetically be teaching you your way around a fantasy kitchen. Hell, even in my short time on YouTube, some people have left comments about being inspired to learn how to cook just from seeing Senshi do it. If that's not influence, I don't know what is. But even beyond the actual act of cooking, arguably more important, Senshi offers the philosophies behind cooking, the heart behind it. Feed the youngins before yourself. Don't take shortcuts. Leave where you are better than how you found it. It's through Senshi that Dungeon Meshi gives these kind of life lessons, and they don't seem lame or preachy because they're coming from exactly the character that we need to hear it from, unless it's this moment in your chill shock. Maybe the most famous, or perhaps infamous, chef character in anime is of course Sanji from One Piece, and honestly it's hard not to notice the parallels between the two. Both characters have a backstory about being trapped without food and forced to survive. Both had an older male father figure-like character that offered them some semblance of safety and comfort in food. And both came out of that experience wanting to be the same type of person that can offer that same type of hope to people. At the heart of Sanji and Senshi both, there's a certain inherent kindness through cooking. There's hope through cooking. Cooking isn't just something these characters do or a profession or a hobby. It's a dedicated act through which they want to offer the same kindness, the same hope that they once needed to others that might need it now. Both characters' mantra is to never let anybody go hungry because they know what it's like to actually be the one in need. Food waste is a cardinal sin because at their lowest point, they would have done anything even for those scraps. Which leads us to one more thing that I'd like to talk about and that I'd be remiss not to revisit after my last Senshi video. In my last video, I wondered aloud who Senshi was, where did he come from? But since then, of course, we've gotten his full backstory, so we can actually go over that now. It's hard to narrow any of my favorite things in Delicious in Dungeon down to just one thing. Kind of like a buffet, I just like it all. But I think I only have one favorite episode. Griffin's Soup is the penultimate story arc of Dungeon Meshi Season 1, and it's the episode where we finally learn about Senshi's past. Up until now, our favorite dwarven chef has been a total man of mystery, with hints at his place in the story but never actually any confirmation. Throughout the series, I went from wondering if Senshi was some kind of on-the-run criminal to maybe like a ghost. That's real, by the way. I should make a video with all of my worst Dungeon Meshi predictions. To one of the ancient dwarves of the East and West Wars. But the answer is far more simple and effective than all of that. Senshi and his team of dwarven miners were the ones who discovered the dungeon. In the lead up to Griffin's Soup, as the party ventures further into the lower levels of the dungeon, we see hints of what might have happened with Senshi's party. The stripped gold of the columns, Senshi's sudden extreme fear of a monster, which is something we haven't seen at all before, and the seeds of this idea that maybe some dwarves could have gotten lost in the dungeon somehow. It's these subtle suggestions that guide us toward the story that Ryoko Kui has been laying the groundwork for with Senshi up until now. And the payoff is, of course, in Griffin's Soup. Not like literally in the soup, but you get what I mean. One of my favorite aspects of Dungeon Meshi, something that I think is one of the series' biggest strengths, is that there's this constant push-pull with how dark does this series get. We have moments of body horror and black magic and blood rituals and other horrific events, but it's always balanced out with the humor and the levity of the main cast and the general writing style. But as soon as I realized that there was a capacity for some darker, heavier themes in this series, there was one specific thing that I was horrified that we might touch on. In a series based around eating, with the mantra, eat or be eaten, there was always this constant nagging fear in the back of my mind that the series could truly go into some dark territory. After all, eating your fellow adventurers is about as grim as things get. And with Griffin's Soup, we finally go there. Senshi's backstory is simple enough. A team of dwarven miners on a hunt for treasure discover a golden dungeon that will surely lead to the vast riches inside. However, blinded by their lust for wealth, the dwarves end up getting lost in the dungeon's catacombs, and without a way to discern an exit and with their supplies dwindling to perilously low levels, what started as a way to strike it rich has become an all-out fight for survival. It doesn't help that outside is a griffin who has targeted the dwarves' quarry, and whenever any of them step out to look for food, water, a way out, anything, they're picked off and eaten one by one. This is a harrowing situation, and we see Senshi go from this bright-eyed young dwarf to a haunted, emaciated facsimile of his old self, going so far as to eat rocks in the encampment for any kind of reprieve from his hunger. When Senshi's caught literally attempting to eat dirt off the ground, one of his companions, Brigand, in a fit of building tensions, claims that Senshi is hiding food from the party. Gillen, the leader of the group, confronts Brigand, and the two go out in the dungeon to settle their disagreement with fists. There's a horrific sound, screams, and then Gillen comes in with some new meat for a soup. If that sounds like a horrific situation, that's because it is. As Gillen and Senshi make soup from this mystery meat, Senshi's horrified. But what's he going to do? They're starving. Senshi ate the soup, which he describes as just meat and water, not a single seasoning, just like your white friend's mom's boiled chicken. Gillen, you were not invited to the potluck. Even after he eventually made it out of the dungeon, and the years have gone by, Senshi has wondered his entire life whether or not he ate his dead companion all those years ago. Now, that's a hell of an effective backstory. Like I said earlier, it kind of parallels Sanji's backstory from the early episodes of One Piece, where Sanji and Zeph are stranded on an island, and it's Zeph that extends the same kindness to Sanji as Gillen extends to Senshi. They're both heroically making sure the kid, the youngin', eats even at the cost of their own survival. Sanji's backstory is one of the first truly heavy moments in One Piece, but it's also incredibly touching and does so much of the heavy lifting on why we understand that Sanji not only loves food, not only sees it as the privilege that it is, but has vowed never to let anyone go hungry, even if they might not deserve that kindness. Of course, there's later more that we find out about Sanji too, but we'll save that for my One Piece video essay era. Senshi is a very similar idea executed a little bit differently. In part, we can trace Senshi's love of cooking back to this story and to his dwarven boss Gillen. Even in the brief moments of this backstory, it's clear to see that Gillen always took care of Senshi, and it's something that subtly informs Senshi's character going forward in the story. He aims to be the same light in the darkness that was offered to him, the same hope. He knows how hard it is being a youngin' in a team of adventurers, and pays it forward with how he treats his companions. To him, Laios, Marcel, and especially Chilchuck and later Izutsumi are all youngins that need to be cared for. In contrast to Sanji, who's clearly a bit more hot-headed and typically shonen-coded, Senshi takes it upon himself to become that father figure that he saw in Gillen. But it's not only this relationship with his companions. Senshi is almost universally beloved among the denizens of the dungeon, including thieves, orcs, and even monsters like golems or the Kelpie. Before I try to murder him, but we'll pretend like that never happened. Senshi never intentionally hurts things in the dungeon. He never takes more than he needs. He cares about the dungeon not only as a physical location, but as an ecosystem, as a community. In disrupting the natural flow of things, the entire dungeon suffers as a result. Maybe it's because of this that he feels so strongly compelled to aiding Laios' mission. He knows that whatever changes are happening in the dungeon aren't good and aims to get things back to normal. Or whatever normal is in a magic dungeon that may or may not be twisting to the desires of the adventurers inside. We'll leave that up to you. Senshi's culinary mind is also how we get several interesting analogies to the very real, very not about food circumstances that characters in the series are faced with. It's through this ongoing egg metaphor that we come to understand the new realities that have befallen Fallon and Izutsumi, and even come to grasp what souls mean in the greater scope of this dungeon. Fallon's body is an egg stuck to something else in a pan, which brings the hope that maybe severing the two parts into salvageable ingredients is still possible. But Izutsumi is more like an omelet, where picking out the ingredients might be utterly disastrous without ruining what made it. It's through Senshi that we also get the season finale's final bit of hope towards the entire predicament. If things eaten in the dungeon aren't part of this whole soul dungeon desires digestive system, then maybe the way to save Fallon might just be by eating the dragon half so the human half is free. Senshi's cooking is usually capstoned by these little morals of each episode and dish, that using magic conveniences instead of doing the work isn't always the right thing to do, that taking more than necessary could upset a natural cycle that depends on those things. But most of all, that cooking isn't just about food, it's a way to bring people together, to make people happy, to show love. And I think that's what gives Senshi and Dungeon Meshi as a whole such heart as a series. No matter how dark things get, how grim the stakes, how brutal the fights become, there's always that moment where a home-cooked meal brings things back down to earth. A shared meal, a moment of peace and respite between friends. Despite the ever-increasing chaos happening all around them, that can all wait for a second, because right now it's time for some dungeon food. After all, You gotta eat, right? Thank you guys for checking out this video. If you like it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and maybe even leave a comment. What are your thoughts on Senshi? What were you thinking at this point in the story? And where do you think his character can go from here? Leave a comment with who else you'd like to see me touch on. I've done a bunch of Dungeon Meshi videos, so if you like this kind of stuff, be sure to check out the rest of my channel. And if you'd like to see me react to Delicious in Dungeon, both the anime and the manga, as well as some other series, you can check out my second channel and my Patreon. The Patreon is the best way to support the channel and me in making these videos in the future. So if you like what you see and want to help me keep doing this, you can check out the Patreon. There's tiers for as little as $1, and even $1 goes a long way. So anyway, thank you so much, and until next time.